00000. In early 1967, a directive circulated through COSVN, Central Office for South Vietnam, the shadow command structure running the war below the 17th parallel. The document acknowledged that American electronic detection equipment would likely render conventional mines obsolete within a year. Maybe two. Communist cadres were instructed to develop countermeasures against sensors that didn't exist yet, to assume the Americans would solve the mine problem the way they solved everything else, with technology and money. COSVN was wrong. Spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. By 1969, mines and booby traps weren't obsolete. They were the single most effective weapon the Viet Cong possessed. A staff sergeant working the statistical desk at MACV headquarters in Saigon would have been among the first to see the pattern clearly. The casualty reporting system fed numbers into that building every week, and somewhere around mid-1969, those numbers started telling a story that made no sense against conventional military logic. Mines and booby traps were responsible for somewhere between 17 and 25% of all American deaths in Vietnam, depending on the quarter. In some divisions operating in the southern provinces, the figure ran closer to 70% of all casualties, killed and wounded combined. If this kind of history matters to you, and you're still here at this point, I'm guessing it does, a subscribe and a like go further than you'd think. Keeps the channel running. And if there's a war you want pulled apart like this, drop it in the comments. The sergeant didn't need a security clearance to understand what those numbers meant. A weapon the enemy's own leadership had written off as a temporary nuisance was now inflicting more damage than AK-47s and mortars, more than RPGs and recoilless rifles combined. The Viet Cong had stumbled into the most effective asymmetric strategy of the entire war almost by accident, and the technology COSVN feared? It barely materialized. The Americans poured resources into mine detection, metallic detectors, acoustic sensors, infrared imaging, dogs trained on explosive scent. The results were miserable. The ANPS-11 mine detector could find a metal-cased mine buried 6 inches deep. The problem was that most Viet Cong mines didn't have metal cases. They were packed in bamboo, coconut shells, ceramic pots, old ammunition boxes with the metal components stripped out. The MACV analyst, staring at his weekly report, wouldn't have known about the COSVN directive. Compartmentalization worked both ways, but he could read a trend line. And the trend line said American soldiers were being killed at an accelerating rate by a weapon nobody had a good answer for. The most technologically advanced military on Earth was losing men to pressure-detonated artillery shells buried in mud. The field manual weighed about 1.5 pounds. FM 5-31, Booby Traps, published 1965. The Army's attempt to compress everything it knew about improvised explosive threats into a handbook small enough to fit in a cargo pocket. Most of the doctrine inside came from World War II. The diagrams showed German Tellermines and Soviet TMDBs, devices manufactured in factories with standardized fusing mechanisms and predictable blast radii. A combat engineer who memorized every page of that manual and deployed to Vietnam in 1966 would have found it almost useless within a week. The baseline numbers tell you why. During World War II, mines and booby traps accounted for roughly 2.5% of American battle deaths in the European theater. Korea pushed that figure up to about 4%. These were wars with defined front lines and massed armor formations, where artillery barrages killed in volume. Mines existed as a tactical nuisance. Dangerous, yes, but a secondary concern compared to the sheer lethality of conventional combined arms warfare. An infantry company crossing a marked minefield in France had engineers with Bangalore torpedoes and mine rollers. The problem was identifiable, bounded, solvable. Vietnam broke every assumption underneath those numbers. By 1969, the mine casualty rate had climbed to somewhere between 16 and 30% of all American combat deaths, depending on which unit you tracked and how the reporting command categorized wounds. The 25th Infantry Division operating in Tây Ninh and Hangzhou provinces reported periods where mines caused more than 70% of their total casualties. The 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta saw similar figures. According to a 1970 study commissioned by the Army's Weapons Systems Analysis Office, no American conflict had ever produced mine casualty rates even close to these numbers. Their word for the trend was unprecedented. I'd call it something stronger. The geography made the difference, but not in the way most people assume. You might think jungle was the problem, dense vegetation hiding buried charges. In reality, the worst mine country was the paddy land. Flat, wet, crisscrossed with dikes and trails that channeled foot traffic into predictable corridors. A Viet Cong sapper didn't need to guess where Americans would walk. The terrain told him. Trail junctions, dike crossings, ford points over canals, all of them became natural kill zones. The mud was soft enough to bury a 105mm artillery round in 15 minutes and leave no visible trace after the next rain. The British had dealt with something vaguely comparable during the Malayan emergency in the 1950s. Communist guerrillas using improvised devices along jungle tracks. But Malaya had a fraction of the population density, a fraction of the available explosive material, and the British operated with far smaller units covering far less ground. The scale wasn't close. Anyway, what made Vietnam fundamentally different from every previous American war was the absence of a front line. In France, in Korea, you could point to a map and say the enemy is over there. Mines existed in the space between your positions and his, and you could mark minefields, record them, plan around them. In Vietnam, the enemy lived inside the population. There was no battlefield, and there was every battlefield. A company could sweep a village at dawn and take a mine casualty still on the same trail, walking back to base that afternoon. The Viet Cong didn't need to hold terrain. They just needed to make moving through it expensive, and they had essentially unlimited raw material. This is the part that drove the ordnance disposal people to frustration. American aircraft dropped roughly 7.8 million tons of bombs on Southeast Asia between 1965 and 1973. Unexploded ordnance rates ran between 5 and 15%, depending on munition type and delivery altitude. Do the math on that. Hundreds of thousands of tons of live American explosives scattered across the countryside, free for the taking. The Viet Cong were building mines out of bombs the United States had already paid for and dropped. A dud 750-pound bomb contained enough Composition B to build dozens of anti-personnel devices. The combat engineers arriving in-country with their copies of FM 5-31 were walking into a problem their training had never anticipated. The manual assumed a knowable enemy using knowable weapons in a space that refused to stay fixed. The smell hit you first. Cordite and wet earth and something metallic underneath, like old pennies left in rainwater. That was the scent of a Viet Cong mine workshop, usually a tunnel complex or a thatch-roofed hut set back from a canal, staffed by 2 or 3 cadres who had learned demolitions the way most people learn carpentry. By doing it until they stopped making fatal mistakes. The raw inventory was staggering. A captured workshop in Long An province during 1968 yielded 42 American M26 grenades, 17 intact 60mm mortar rounds, 6 dud 105mm artillery shells, and roughly 80 pounds of loose TNT scraped from other munitions. All American manufactured. The after-action report from the unit that found the cache noted the irony without comment. What these workshops produced defied cataloging. The 18th Engineer Brigade, the senior combat engineer command in Vietnam, attempted a comprehensive taxonomy of enemy explosive devices sometime around 1969. They gave up. The internal assessment used language you don't normally see in military engineering documents. Systematic countermeasures were described as almost impossible because the enemy wasn't building to any standard. A pressure-detonated mine might use a bamboo firing mechanism 1 week and a carved wooden dowel the next. The explosive fill could be Composition B from an American bomb, picric acid cooked from fertilizer, black powder packed into a length of pipe, or some combination of all 3. Every device was essentially a prototype. The smallest were built from 50 caliber cartridges buried nose up with the primer resting on a nail. Step on it and the round fired straight through your boot. These wouldn't kill a man outright, but they'd take off toes and shatter metatarsals, a casualty who needed evacuation, medical resources, helicopter time, command attention. The largest used entire dud bombs, rigged with pressure plates made from 2 boards, and a clothespin with a strip of metal bridging the electrical contacts. The French had encountered something similar in Algeria during the late 50s. FLN fighters repurposing military ordnance into roadside charges with whatever materials existed locally. But that's beside the point. The Algerian devices were crude by comparison, and the French were fighting over far less ground. What made the Vietnamese system different was its deliberate decentralization. COSVN published instructional manuals, actual printed booklets with diagrams on mine construction techniques. District-level cadres received quotas. Monthly production targets for explosive devices assigned the same way a regional office might assign sales figures. The infrastructure wasn't improvised at all. Only the weapons were. 4:30 a.m. Still dark. The temperature already sitting at 80 degrees with humidity that made your uniform stick to skin before you'd taken 10 steps outside the wire. Somewhere in every base camp along the major supply routes. Route 1, Route 13, Route 19, Thunder Road through Binh Duong Province, combat engineers were pulling on flak jackets and drawing mine detectors from the equipment shed. The daily road sweep started before dawn because convoys rolled at first light, and nothing moved until the engineers said it could move. The standard formation put a mine detection team on the road surface itself. 2 or 3 men walking abreast with AN, PAS 11 detectors, headphones on, listening for the faint tone shift that indicated buried metal. Behind them, usually 50 meters back, came a security element. Flankers walked the shoulders and berms on either side, eyes on the ground, looking for the visual indicators that separated a mined stretch of road from a clean one. Fresh digging. Displaced laterite. A patch of dirt slightly darker than the surrounding surface, where someone had turned the soil after midnight. Trip wires caught the early light if you were lucky. If the sun angle was wrong, you walked right into them. The whole formation moved at roughly the speed of a man reading a newspaper while walking. Slow enough to process every anomaly. Fast enough to clear the road before the convoy schedule fell apart. The problem was the detector itself. The AN-PES 11 was a metallic mine detector. It worked by generating an electromagnetic field and registering disruptions caused by ferrous or non-ferrous metal in the soil. Against a Soviet TM-46 anti-tank mine with a steel casing, the thing performed adequately. Against a Viet Cong pressure mine built from a ceramic pot filled with explosive and triggered by a bamboo pressure plate with 0 metal components, and this was the majority of what the engineers were actually facing. The detector was useless. It would read clean. The operator would signal all clear. And the 2.5-ton truck, following 30 minutes later, would detonate the charge with its front axle. Engineers adapted by relying less on electronics and more on their eyes. Probing rods became standard. Thin metal stakes pushed into the road surface at a 30-degree angle, feeling for the resistance change that indicated a buried object. A skilled operator could probe a 1-meter square of road in about 45 seconds. Do the arithmetic on a 6-kilometer stretch of highway, and you understand why sweeps took hours. Some teams used bayonets. The technique was identical to what deminers use today in Cambodia and Laos. Slow, deliberate, physical contact with the earth, your hands telling you what your equipment couldn't. The Viet Cong understood the sweep schedule with disturbing precision. Mines were emplaced between 2 and 4 a.m. after the last American patrol had passed and before the engineers stepped off. Local cadres tracked the timing. In some areas, the emplacement teams watched the base camp gates from concealed positions and waited until the sweep team was visible before withdrawing. According to interrogation reports from Hoang Gia province, sappers were told to prioritize roads that had been swept the previous day because American convoys treated a swept road as safe for 24 hours. The logic was circular and vicious. The sweep created the pattern, and the pattern created the vulnerability. What this did to the men walking point defies clinical description. The psychological literature on combat stress in Vietnam identifies mine warfare as a distinct category of trauma, separate from firefight stress or artillery exposure. A soldier in a firefight can shoot back. He can identify the threat, take cover, return fire, do something with his hands. A soldier walking a mine sweep is waiting for the ground to explode underneath him. There is no direction to face, no enemy silhouette to acquire. Every step is a decision, and every decision might be the last one. Engineer units in high-threat areas reported psychiatric casualty rates that exceeded their physical casualty rates in some quarters. Men developed what the medical officers documented as extreme hypervigilance, an inability to stop scanning the ground even off-duty, even stateside, even years later. The road they cleared at dawn would be dirty again by the following morning. Everyone knew it. The sweeps weren't solving the mine problem. They were managing it the way you manage a chronic illness. Buying time, reducing harm at the margins, never pretending the underlying condition was going away. A combat engineer in the 20th Engineer Battalion described the daily sweep rotation in terms I can't improve on. He called it mowing a lawn that grows back with teeth. Siuchi District, 1967. The perimeter wire at a fire support base belonging to the 25th Infantry Division had been strung with M18A1 Claymore mines at 10 to 15 meter intervals, standard defensive doctrine, straight out of the Engineer Field Manual. Each Claymore contained 700 steel balls embedded in a curved block of C4 explosive, designed to spray a 60-degree lethal arc out to 50 meters. The words "front toward enemy" were embossed into the olive drab casing in raised letters you could read by touch in total darkness. The whole device was brutally simple. Point the convex face at the kill zone, run the wire back to your fighting position, squeeze the M57 firing device when the enemy entered the arc. The Viet Cong figured out the countermove almost immediately. Sappers, and these were among the most skilled fighters in the entire Viet Cong structure. Men who trained for months in crawling, wire cutting, and explosive handling, would breach the outer wire at night, locate the claymore by following the detonation cord back from the firing position, and rotate the mine 180 degrees on its legs. The embossed text now faced the American bunker. The electrical wire remained connected. Everything looked correct from 20 meters away in the dark. When the perimeter came under probe or ground attack, and the defending soldier squeezed the clacker, he detonated 700 steel balls directly into his own position. The 27th Engineer Battalion documented this problem in reports that use language bordering on desperation. Troops were described as afraid to detonate claymores during contact, which meant the single most effective close defense weapon in the American arsenal was becoming psychologically unusable. A fire support base under ground assault at 2 a.m., sappers in the wire, and the men on the perimeter won't fire their own claymores because they can't be certain which direction the mines are facing. The weapon designed to make perimeter defense survivable had become another source of dread. Units tried fixes. Some ran checks every hour, sending men outside the wire to physically touch each claymore and verify its orientation. This created its own problem. Soldiers moving through their own defensive perimeter in darkness, exposed, making noise, vulnerable to the same sappers they were trying to defeat. Other units wired the claymores in place with additional stakes or sandbags, making rotation harder. The Viet Cong adapted by simply removing the mines entirely and carrying them away for reuse. A 1968 logistics estimate from Thury Corps suggested that captured claymores constituted a meaningful percentage of the directional fragmentation weapons the enemy employed in ambushes along Route 13. The broader pattern was maddening. American M26 grenades with their pins pulled and spoons held down by rubber bands wedged into tin cans buried along trails. When a boot caught the tripwire, the can tipped, the grenade rolled free, and the spoon flew. 105mm illumination rounds, their parachute flare assemblies removed and replaced with pressure fuses, buried as anti-vehicle mines. M14 anti-personnel toe poppers, originally scattered by the millions as area denial weapons, dug up and repositioned on paths American patrols were known to use. The Viet Cong were running a recycling operation of staggering scale, and the raw material was being supplied, free of charge, by the United States military. An ordnance disposal officer with the 59th Land Clearing Company noted in his unit diary that on certain weeks, more than half the devices his team neutralized contained components manufactured in American factories. His phrasing was dry, the way EOD people tend to be when they're handling something that could kill them. He wrote that the enemy had excellent taste in munitions and preferred American-made products to Chinese or Soviet alternatives whenever available. There's a detail buried in the 27th Engineer Battalion records that goes nowhere, but I can't leave out. Someone at battalion level requisitioned 600 replacement claymores in a single quarter. Not because the unit was expanding its perimeter coverage, but because the originals kept disappearing. 600 mines. The supply request was approved without comment. The heat off a Rome plow blade in direct sun could blister skin at a distance of 6 inches. Crews working the big D7E tractors in the Iron Triangle wore leather gloves that soaked through with sweat inside 20 minutes, and the vibration from the 20,000-pound machine transmitted up through the seat frame into the lower spine with a frequency that loosened fillings. This was the American technological answer to the mine threat. Brute mechanical force applied to the landscape itself. If you couldn't find the mines, you'd strip away the earth that hid them. The concept wasn't new. In Korea, engineers had used tank-mounted mine rollers, heavy segmented wheels pushed ahead of the vehicle on a rigid frame, detonating pressure-fuse mines before the tank's own tracks reached them. Vietnam saw a direct adaptation. M48 Patton tanks fitted with roller assemblies led convoy routes in the most heavily mined sectors. Behind them came vehicles with plow attachments, angled steel blades mounted low enough to dig into the road surface and physically turn the top 12 inches of soil, exposing buried ordnance. The theory was sound. The execution ran into the same wall everything ran into. The rollers weighed enough to detonate anti-tank mines rated for vehicle pressure. Most of the time. But the Viet Cong had started using command-detonated charges, an observer hiding in the tree line with a wire or a battery, waiting for the roller to pass and triggering the device under the tank itself. The roller would clear the road. The tank behind it would burn. Crews in the 2nd 34th Armor Battalions learned this sequence the hard way across months of operations in 3rd Corps, and their assessment landed on desks at brigade level with the kind of blunt finality that tends to end careers. The VC are capable of interdicting any route regardless of size by the use of mines. That sentence sat in an official battalion report. No qualifiers, no hedging about future improvements or doctrinal adjustments. A flat admission. Other approaches came and went. Napalm drops ahead of convoy routes. The theory being that the thermal pulse would detonate shallow buried mines, or at minimum, burn away the vegetation that concealed emplacement teams. Engineers experimented with water jets to wash away road surfaces and expose devices without detonation. Helicopter-mounted infrared sensors were tested on the premise that recently disturbed Earth retained heat differently than compacted road surface. The IR worked in laboratory conditions. In the field, where the ambient ground temperature was 90+ degrees, and water buffalo crossed the road 4 times daily, the thermal signature of a buried mine was indistinguishable from the thermal signature of a hoofprint. So what actually reduced mine casualties? Mostly, it was pattern disruption. Units that varied their routes, changed convoy timing unpredictably, ran false sweeps to confuse emplacement teams, sent decoy vehicles ahead on alternate roads. These units bled less. The solution wasn't technological, it was behavioral, and it required commanders to accept slower movement, less efficient logistics, routes that doubled back on themselves for no reason a supply officer would approve. The Army as an institution hated this. Efficiency was doctrine. Predictability was how you moved 400,000 men and their equipment across a country with 6 paved highways. The engineers kept sweeping, rollers kept rolling, and plows kept turning earth. And every morning the roads had new mines in them, built from American shells, detonated by men who earned the equivalent of $3 a month and moved on foot through terrain the machines couldn't follow. A sergeant with the 265th Engineer Company wrote home in 1969 that he'd stopped counting the devices his team found because the number had stopped meaning anything. He rotated back to Fort Leonard Wood 4 months later with both legs. What did a mine do to a human body that a bullet didn't? The wound profiles were categorically different. A round from an AK-47 created a roughly cylindrical permanent cavity through tissue, entry wound, wound channel, exit wound if the ballistics allowed it. Surgeons at the 24th Evacuation Hospital in Long Bin could classify gunshot trauma on a spectrum they understood. Mine injuries broke that spectrum apart. The blast wave from even a small anti-personnel device traveled upward through the foot and leg at velocities exceeding 26,000 feet per second, shattering bone into fragments that became secondary projectiles inside the limb itself. Soil, gravel, boot leather, pieces of the mine casing, all of it driven deep into tissue in a radial pattern. No surgeon could fully debride in a single operation. The average mine casualty at Brooke Army Medical Center required 4.7 surgical procedures. Gunshot casualties averaged 1.8. The amputation rate tells the rest. Mine and booby trap casualties accounted for a vastly disproportionate share of traumatic amputations in Vietnam compared to their percentage of total wounded. A 1971 study out of Walter Reed documented that lower extremity amputees from mine injuries were younger on average than other combat wounded, 19.4 years old. Younger because the men walking point on sweeps and patrols tended to be the newest arrivals, the lowest ranking, the ones without enough time in country to have negotiated their way off the trail. You might think the physical wound was the worst of it, but the orthopedic surgeons at Fitzsimmons General Hospital wrote something in their case notes that reframes the entire injury pattern. They observed that mine casualties exhibited psychological responses qualitatively different from other combat trauma patients. Not worse on a simple scale, but different in structure. The randomness was the mechanism. A firefight had a narrative, an ambush had a sequence, a mine had nothing. One step you're walking, the next step the world detonates from below. No warning, no enemy visible, no context anyone could reconstruct afterward. The brain couldn't file it, couldn't build a story around it that made the experience survivable in memory. Rehabilitation wards at Valley Forge Army Hospital and Denver's Fitzsimmons filled with men in their early 20s learning to walk on prosthetics that weighed 4 pounds and chafed the stump raw inside a week. The phantom pain literature from this period is extensive. 78% of amputees reported sensation in the missing limb, and for a significant subset, the sensation was the moment of detonation replaying on a neurological loop. The limb was gone, but the blast kept arriving. The British had dealt with mine casualties in Malaya a decade earlier, but the scale was different by orders of magnitude. Malaya produced dozens of amputees. Vietnam produced thousands. The VA system that received them had been built for World War. 2 veterans aging into cardiac disease and cancer. It was not staffed or funded for 20-year-old triple amputees. And no one had conceptually prepared for men who couldn't sleep because the ground still felt wrong under their remaining foot. Quang Tri Province, 2009. A farmer named Nguyen Van Dat was digging a foundation for a storage shed when his shovel struck metal at 18 inches depth. The object was a 105mm high explosive round, American manufacture, lot date 1967. It had been in the ground for 42 years. The fuse was still live. A Vietnamese explosive ordnance disposal team from Project Renew drove out, confirmed the shell was functional, and detonated it in place. The blast left a crater 4 feet across in what had been, until that morning, a man's backyard. The Vietnamese Ministry of Defense completed a national survey in 2010 that quantified what the EOD teams already knew from daily experience. 16.3 million acres of Vietnamese soil remained contaminated with unexploded ordnance. Put differently, roughly 24% of the country's total land area, more than 6.8 million tons of bombs and munitions were dropped or fired on Vietnam between 1965 and 1975, and the standard dud rate for American-manufactured ordnance in that period ran between 5 and 30%, depending on the munition type. The 105mm shell, the same round the Viet Cong had dug up and turned into command-detonated mines along Route 1 and Route 13, was among the most common items recovered. Since 1975, over 40,000 Vietnamese civilians have been killed by unexploded ordnance. More than 60,000 have been injured. The amputation rate among civilian mine and UXO victims runs close to 20%, and the victims skew young because children find objects in fields and pick them up. The combat engineers who served with units like the 27th Engineer Battalion and the 588th Engineer Company used a specific phrase in their after-action reports, their oral histories, their letters home. They called Vietnam the most mined battlefield in history. You might argue that's the kind of claim men make when they're exhausted and traumatized. Every generation of combat veterans believes their war was the worst. But the data supports them with almost no room for argument. World War II's North African campaign, El Alamein, the most heavily mined set-piece battle of that war, involved an estimated 3 million mines across a front roughly 40 miles wide. The Soviet-German front saw mine densities of 2,400 per kilometer in prepared defensive belts. Staggering concentrations, but bounded. You could map them because they existed within a doctrinal framework that dictated where mines went and why. Vietnam had no front, no rear, no flanks. The mine threat existed on every road, every trail, every rice paddy dike, every landing zone, every firebase perimeter, in every province from the DMZ to the Mekong Delta, every day, for 10 years. The density per square mile may have been lower than Kursk. The total contaminated area dwarfed anything in the historical record. The final accounting went into a file at the Army Center of Military History. Mine and booby trap casualties in Vietnam, the combined total of killed and wounded from all explosive devices that weren't delivered by direct or indirect fire, were classified under casualty category codes that lumped them together with miscellaneous causes for the first several years of the war. The tracking methodology wasn't standardized until 1966. Before that, a man killed by a toe popper and a man killed by a sniper round might appear in the same statistical column. The Gruber study, commissioned by the Surgeon General's office in 1970, attempted to disaggregate the numbers retroactively, working from hospital admission records at Brooke, Walter Reed, and the evacuation hospitals in-country. The report ran to several hundred pages. It was assigned the document classification AD 744359 in the Defense Technical Information Center database. Limited distribution. The cover page listed the title in bureaucratic language so bloodless it almost qualifies as poetry. Gruber, S.H. Survey of Mine and Booby Trap Injuries, United States Army, Republic of Vietnam, 1965 through 1970. Somewhere in Long Binh, the morning after that report was filed, an engineer platoon leader woke up at 4:30, checked his mine detector batteries, and walked his team to the start point of route clearing operation number, whatever came next. Breakfast was cold sea rations, ham and lima beans. The men called them ham and mothers.